Hello, everyone. Good to see a full house. Well, it's my great honor to introduce Judith Bronstein. And she was already introduced yesterday by Rachel Manette. And she spoke to Judith's distinguished academic career or her credentials and awards. So I wanted to focus more on what I think it has been her impact on our discipline. And I think that, well, first of all, the world of mutualisms or the study of mutualism at the time that Judy came to the ecological research, the discipline, it was a very underdeveloped field in many ways. And it was also, like, so much so that the book by Mittelbach and McGill that is called Community Ecology called mutualisms as the bastard child of community ecology, right? So Judy came to this field to really study these interactions with such a conceptual rigor, dedication, and a synthetic mind that elevated these interactions, species interactions, to a level that we all now can realize their importance in ecology. So, and that has inspired people like me to follow that path. And that's not just because this intellectual rigor, but also this synthetic mind that has been able to synthesize big bodies of research into these roadmaps that are so well articulated, that are so easy to follow and understand, thanks to her brilliant mind. So I really, I want to honor that legacy that she has left for us. And also, that roadmap has left us with very important big questions that she's clearly passionate about. And clearly we saw that yesterday. And finally, in terms of what I think is her legacy, is her mentorship. Many junior ecologists that now are not so junior, and I think in a way myself included, have been mentored by Judy. And I think that she has made a big difference in the field in terms of inclusivity, in terms of changing the culture we have seen that was not so productive for many in past years, to a culture that now is inclusive, is rigorous, and also, I want to say, intellectually honest, which I think that Judy has such a big say on that, intellectually honest. So with that, I want to thank Judith for being here, and I'm so happy that we were able to bring her and honor her career with this story lectureship.
Well, it's all downhill from there, right? I have to say, I just recorded that and sent it to my family. Do you want your iPad? It was there. Thank you so much, Fernanda, and thank you, everybody, for making another amazing trip for me to Davis. It's been wonderful from start to finish, and I'm going to have to sleep for a week after this, I have to tell you. So yeah, I want to talk about the stuff that I'm most excited about right now. And it's going to riff off some of the things I talked about yesterday, but really and I will return to some of the same interactions, but it's an independent talk. So if you didn't hear the earlier talk, it honestly doesn't matter. And let me just say something about where I came from and how I got to this point. I started out at University of Michigan, and Rachel and I shared an advisor, as a plant reproductive biologist. And I was thinking about species interactions like many of us from the perspective of one of the two partners. And in this case, it was plants. And I was a pollination ecologist, very much plant-oriented. And through one thing or another, particularly going to OTS, I started thinking more about mutualisms, and particularly the reciprocal effects, both ecological and evolutionary. Spent a lot of years studying fig wasps and figs, yuccas and yucca moths, very much obligate pollination mutualisms. And from that, I sort of got into really my first love, which is big conceptual thinking and the big questions in the field. And so where I've been like for the last 20 years is thinking about conceptual development for mutualism writ large. It's a very, very young field, as I was talking about yesterday, and I was lucky enough to enter it at a time when there was very little going on. So almost anything I did was the first time it had been done. That doesn't mean it was important, but it was the first time it was done. And so I've had the unique opportunity of seeing the development of the field. And sort of at the end, I'll return to this and tell you like where I've moved most recently. So, you know, ultimately, from starting as a pollination biologist to moving to a conceptual thinker about mutualism, you'd have to say, in this classic grid of species interactions that we always present to our students, I'm there, right? I've asked many questions. I've used many tools. We were talking about tools last night, and a variety of systems. I'm going to talk about 3 of my systems today. But you'd have to say I was kind of solidly in that little square there. But, you know, as I have been thinking about mutualism particularly the last few years, I have to ask myself, is the kind of questions I ask and the systems I study, does that block really circumscribe my work? And the answer is no. For that matter, does that square circumscribe anybody's work working on mutualism? A lot of you work on mutualism. No, we're not sitting very squarely in that square. For that matter, let's say some of you work on predator-prey interactions or competition. Does any block circumscribe anybody's work on that interaction? No, not really. And yet we talk as if they do, right? We start with this grid of names, and we jump off from there. And like, why do we do that? Why do we start by polarizing these concepts, which we've done throughout the history of ecology, right? The human mind likes grids. It's a way of organizing a vast smear of all our knowledge and starting to see what is similar about things and what is different about things is that you give things names and you stick them as a set of boxes. We do this over and over again in ecology. But the thing is, you know, what's going on between these squares, right? We know it's not really blank. We know that there's interactions among all these things, but we also don't pay that a whole heck of a lot of attention, right? And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about what isn't in those squares, or how what is not in that area influences what we know about any one of those squares. Now, you know, in general, what's the problem with thinking in grids? Well, it interferes with understanding nature. For instance, as I'm going to be talking about, there's interactions that just don't want to be in one box. They want to be in 2 boxes. Or over ecological or evolutionary time or space, they're wandering around here, right? So if we think of the world as a grid, we're missing a lot of what's going on in nature. We're missing interesting questions we could be asking, and we're missing kind of interpreting what we learn, right? And you know, you could say, well, that's obvious. It's like, of course, if you study mutualism, you're not really just studying mutualism. But we're also not paying a lot of attention to it, right? And you think about it, this grid thinking really has implications. You look at the textbooks, we teach, for instance, undergraduate ecology and undergraduate introductory biology, it puts different interactions in different chapters. The intro bio textbooks I've taught from, pollination is in the reproduction chapter. All the other interactions are in the species interactions chapter. I don't know why. Our professional meetings run interaction-specific sessions. When I used to go to ESA, there were no mutualism sessions. You know, that only started in like the late 90s. Now there's like 3 or 4 mutualism sessions and a pollination section or 2 or 4 or something. You know, the focal issues that we ask differ according to what kind of interaction we're studying. So if we're interested in mutualism, there's a set of questions we very consistently ask. And if I were giving you a different kind of seminar, it would all be about these things. What are the current big issues in mutualism research? Conflicts and costs. That's really what I talked about yesterday. Context-dependent outcomes, where you change the interaction a bit and it all changes. I'll get back to that. Cheating and its consequences, talked about that yesterday. Co-evolutionary dynamics, dynamics of communities, and then conservation and anthropogenic change. And we kind of organize our thinking around these things, and that's what we do in the world of mutualism. And these questions would be a little different depending on what kind of interactions we were studying. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with, I mean, I hope not, developing a career that's focused on figuring out what the big questions are about mutualism. But there's so much else to do, and that's really what's exciting me. There's so many other exciting research directions to explore once you get outside of this grid view of interactions. And then if you know a lot about one kind of interaction, you have a new perspective on visiting a different kind of interaction for your research. This number 1 is really what I want to talk about today, which is all the other exciting research directions that happen when you start realizing that different interactions on that grid are themselves interacting with each other. And so that's really what I want to do today. And typical of probably every talk I've ever given, and certainly like the one yesterday, lots of ideas, not much data. I have data. Ask me about the data. That's not what the best use of your time is. I want to tell you about the ideas. So these are like the 4 things that I want to talk about today. And I'll develop them using 3 different study systems that I've worked on. A pollination system, that's the interaction between Datura, jimsonweed, and its moth pollinators, bees and their nectar robbers, and then ants and the cacti that they defend. And these are the 4 points. First, interactions can map to more than one place on this grid. Second, interaction outcomes change over evolutionary time. Third, interaction outcomes vary in ecological time and space. And then the last is that interactions interact. Okay, so that's kind of where we're going. And depending on which of those 4 things, as I go through, I'm talking about, I'll be highlighting one of these 3 systems as I go. So lots of systems, lots of methods that I've used, empirical things, field observations, common garden experiments, and some theory. And I'll be reaching to all those things. But it'll be these 3 systems that I focus on. And hopefully, I'll give you just enough of the natural history to let you know, to have you understand where I'm going with this. Of course, I can talk, you know, at infinite length about the natural history of any of these systems, and please, at the end, do ask me that. Okay, so the first point is that interactions can map to more than one place on the grid. And for that, let's think about this interaction between jimsonweed, Datura wrightii in particular, and its very specialized pollinator. The deal with this interaction is that depending on which stage in the life history of this insect you're talking about, it is either a mutualist or an herbivore. So it's unquestionably both. So the deal is this, the Manduca sexta is the tobacco hornworm, so it's kind of our lab rat of the insect world. We know a huge amount about it. In the lab, has a giant brain. You can do surgeries with it. It's also ubiquitous in much of North America. And it's a specialized feeder and layer of eggs on Solanaceae. And in any one place, it tends to have one or two plants that it's focused on. And in my area of the Southwest, the plant is Datura wrightii, this particular ginseng weed. And the deal is this, the adults are almost the exclusive pollinators of this plant. Okay, the plant, if it's going to make outcross seeds, it's got to get that moth. And that moth lays eggs on the plant. When the females visit, they almost invariably lay eggs. They start feeding, and they can eat the entire biomass of the plant, okay? So clearly, if you're going to consider the biology of this interaction, you cannot view this just as a mutualism because the plant needs its pollinators. You can't view it just as a plant-herbivore interaction. It's both, and it's simultaneous, right? So this raises a lot of questions about how this can work, and this how we consider an interaction that wants to be in two places of that grid at once. So one question is, if the plant is going to get pollinated, does it have to pay that price, right? Can a plant get pollinated, but the eggs end up somewhere else? And the answer pretty much is that the plant's got to pay that price. And there's actually a lot of really great neurobiology that's been worked out about this, why that is. It turns out that for the females, feeding on nectar releases actions in the brain associated with oviposition. So if a plant gets the benefit of pollination, it's stuck with eggs. Now, that's different if they attract males, but that's a whole other question that I haven't solved. But so 3/4 of egg-laying visits are made to plants in flower. So most eggs end up on plants on flower. Manduca are more likely to nectar plus oviposit than do only one of those. And the more flowers on a plant that the moth visits, the more eggs she lays. So if you're going to get pollinated, you're almost surely going to be stuck with the cost of getting eggs laid on you. So yeah, they have to pay the price. Then clearly the next question is, so how big is that price, right? How big a cost is it to end up like that after you pollinate? And you know, those of you who have worked on herbivory know that plants can look terrible after herbivores have been through, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're suffering as much as you think they are. You have to get in and measure what the cost of being eaten is. And if you're going to get your head around how a plant can possibly be specialized on a pollinator that's going to do that, it gets to be critical to think, how bad is it to be eaten, okay? The answer is there is almost no cost that we have found of that moth eating those leaves. So we've done lots and lots of kind of experiments on this. And this is just one kind of experiment. This is the big, common garden field experiment kind of thing where you plant a ton of Datura as seedlings. You wait until they're like this big, and then you simulate levels of herbivory, either before or after our summer rains, and you either cut a few leaves or cut a lot of leaves. And it turns out that pretty much no matter what you do, this is control, early light cutting, early heavy cutting, late light, light heavy, whether you look at growth, whether you look at fruit number, whether you look the following year at how they did, you just can't pick up that all this loss of leaves translates into reduced success for the plant. It turns out that it's just not that costly, or that we can't pinpoint a cost of being eaten by your obligate mutualist, right? Which in a way is kind of a relief, right? Because it's like, you could say, the initial question was, how could this possibly work if herbivory was super costly? Because of course, if the plant had some mechanism to deter manduca, it also loses its pollination. Well, the answer is herbivory just doesn't have that much of an effect. Okay, so this raises, a bunch of questions. Can mutualism, antagonism link like this only evolve when the cost of the antagonism is really low, when this is just not that big a deal? Can selection act to lower the cost of, of that, thereby reinforcing the interaction? Can selection break that link entirely? So there's a lot of questions that remain. And one that we actually have gotten to by theoretical approaches is, which comes first, mutualism or antagonism? By that I mean, was the proto-manduca an herbivore that got co-opted to be a pollinator, or was it a pollinator that then started throwing in herbivory? And what this gets at is the question of how interactions can shift over evolutionary time. So in other words, was this a mutualism that also added this? Was it this and added this? And the answer, the reason this is a really interesting question and that people want to get at is that we know that the outcome of interactions evolve, that interactions move among this grid. And in fact, the number one question in the evolutionary literature on mutualism that's asked is, why does mutualism not constantly be breaking down to antagonism? So the thought is that mutualisms are very fragile, and then they're going to be breaking down. So this system, in which it's both mutualism and antagonism, gives us some kind of ability to say, well, how might that evolutionary transition work? Okay, so we can start thinking about what happened with the addition of mutualism and antagonism in the same interaction. And so we developed a hypothesis about this, and we did a bunch of eco-coevolution modeling to try to figure out what the evolutionary transition was in this particular interaction. We got a pretty strong result out of this, which is that initially, this is almost surely was an herbivore of these plants. And then it was co-opted for its feeding on the nectar and became a pollinator. And associated with that was selection on a set of phenotypic traits that probably reinforced the interaction as a mutualism. So that's far and away the simplest route. You start out with an antagonism, and you add an element that allows you to co-opt this antagonist as a mutualist, okay? Now, one of the traits that seems to be really important and that we've looked at both in further modeling but also in empirical work is the evolution of tolerance. In other words, that these plants can be very, very heavily hit by herbivory and yet grow back. It seems extremely likely that this was a plant that was already highly tolerant of herbivory. And that allowed the plant to co-opt an herbivore for a mutualistic function, okay? So once again, the point here is that you can't consider this interaction only a mutualism or only a plant-herbivore interaction. And once you realize that, you start thinking about all kinds of new ways that these two interactions on that grid themselves might interact, both simultaneously, since both are going on at once, but also over evolutionary time as they're shifting back and forth. Now, lots of questions, as always, still remain. And two of them are, that's a very system-specific story I just played out to you. Does it have any generality? Can it help us understand, for instance, how another kind of obligate pollination mutualism where there's consumption, like yuccas and yucca moths, where yucca moth larvae eat the seeds. Can it help us understand that? How about a completely different kind of mutualism, like between plants and rhizobia, where we know there's very high cost? Do models and model systems have to remain system specific once you have a really good understanding of a single system, or can we adopt what it is we know for some kind of general knowledge? And I think that's the kind of question that pervades much of what we do as ecologists. And this is just one little illustration of where does working out a fabulous story in a fabulous single system really get us. But let's move on now to, and obviously I have a lot more to say about that, but I want to move on to this question of how interaction outcomes vary in ecological and evolutionary time. Now, that's not relevant to the Datura system, because wherever you're going to have Datura and Manduka together, you have two life history stages that are interacting differently, right? So we don't have a spatial and temporal issue there. But with many of the systems I've studied, the thing is that the outcome varies, okay? In other words, for instance, an interaction is mutualistic at some places and times, and then is predatory or parasitic at another ecological space or time. This is the whole question of context dependency, which we see again and again in mutualisms. And so now we're going to shift to this other system I study, which is nectar robbing. This is one of the two places I've done a lot of this work. This is in southern Arizona. This is a manzanita species. You guys probably recognize manzanita from California. And it is pollinated by a very large community of small insects, mostly but not exclusively bees. And some of these bees sometimes are pollinators, sometimes switch back and forth between being a pollinator, so going into a flower from the top, and chewing a hole on the side. Or if they can't chew a hole on the side, like honeybees, at least using somebody else's hole. So here you have bees interacting with flowers, sometimes the same bee well, not in this picture, but the same bee interacting with a flower, but with a positive outcome in some places and a potentially negative in another place or time. So that's the sort of thing with interactions like this, particularly where you have bees that can go back and forth. Once again, they're not staying in their one place on the grid. They want to be in different places of time. So here's the other system of nectar robbing that I've been studying. This is in Colorado at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. This is Becky Irwin, another fine Davis student, and Eleanor Lichtenberg, our postdoc. And we've studied this at great length. And what we found, for instance, in this Colorado system is that looking at an individual bee species visiting an individual plant species, almost always, not always, but very often, you find an individual bee at the species level is doing two different things. So for instance, Bombus mixtus on Corydalus, this long pink flower, sometimes is being a primary robber, in other words, making holes, and sometimes being a secondary robber, using the holes of others. Okay, those are non-mutualistic behaviors, but two very distinct kinds of behavior. Bombus mixtus on a different plant, this is bluebells, sometimes, quite often, are legitimate visitors. That's the behavior that can lead to pollination. Sometimes are primary robbers, and sometimes are secondary robbers. So it depends on which plant species you're talking about. But for a given bee species, they're often doing more than one thing. So for instance, you can't reliably say the Bombus bifarius visiting Linaria, butter and eggs, is a mutualist or a non-mutualist. Because sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other, and then the question is, when and why. The interesting thing here, and this was a surprise to us, is that's at the species level. Different individuals are either doing one behavior or the other's behavior. At the individual level, individual bumblebees want to just keep doing what they're doing, right? There's remarkable little switching between different ways of feeding. So individuals are very rarely in this Colorado system going back and forth between being a mutualist and being a non-mutualist. Different individuals want to keep doing what they're doing. So we follow the bees on a long, many-hour route, and they're very consistently hitting every single flower as a nectar robber, or never. But a different individual of the same species, and probably from the same colony, are doing different things. And we thought that really interesting, and yeah, we don't actually know how an individual chooses behavior. This is a question that eluded us, and we would still love to know. What determines why some individuals go one route and some another? We don't know that yet. So what we think is that individuals are either constant to one behavior or constant to another. And it seems like what they're doing is that they are reducing their searching and handling costs. So they're not being exploratory. They're not coming up to a flower and making a decision that one or the other way of feeding is best for the good or the bad of the plant. Rather, they choose a strategy and they just very consistently do it over and over and over again. And again, what we don't know is how they choose that strategy. But they either choose that one or they choose that one and they stick with it. What we find they don't do is this, which is they come up to a flower, make a decision. It's like, I'm going to do this, and no, this flower is better to do that, but this flower is better to do that. So they are not doing much in the way of exploring alternatives. They just want to do what they're doing. This is bumblebees. Honeybees is a whole different story, as it turns out, which is really interesting. So, you know, it's actually kind of good news for the plant if, in the face of nectar robbing, the tactic that the bees are sticking with is the mutualistic strategy. So in other words, often in the literature, particularly the within species cooperation literature, you'll read about the temptation to cheat, right? And I probably used that phrase yesterday. This idea that while they're cooperating, there's always the possibility of cheating if it gives you better returns. These bees, they're not tempted to cheat. Either they're exclusively cheating or they're exclusively being a cooperator. And it doesn't matter what the individual flower traits are. If one of these bees thinks she's a pollinator that day, that is what she's gonna do. The plant traits don't matter. So that's great news if the strategy that is stuck with is the mutualistic one. The problem is that if a bee thinks she's a cheater, then that's a sticky behavior too. And that's all they want to do. And it's actually kind of entertaining because what you see is when a bee thinks she's a nectar robber, bees that make holes generally hate to use someone else's hole. Go figure. So what they will do is they'll visit flower after flower after flower and just make a hole right next to the hole that's already there. So you find corydalus flowers that will have 5 little holes. This is manzanita. You see the same thing. It just looks like little bullet holes. You'll get 5 holes next to each other. Okay, so because they're not checking out each other's holes. It's like they are in the headspace that they are a maker of holes, and they make a hole. And so again, would plant traits change that? This is a bee cognition problem. Now, it's kind of interesting, and this is some fairly recent analysis that I did on this, is that given how nectar replenishes, you might say, like, it's nuts for the bees to keep visiting whole flowers that have been robbed, right? Because robbed flowers should be empty. So why don't they just like skip over them? Well, it turns out that for corydalus, given the way that nectar replenishes, for instance, a 2-day-old flower that was robbed yesterday actually has more nectar than a brand new flower that hasn't been touched by anybody. Because every day they pump in the same amount of nectar. So there's a chance that a bee could hit a flower that had 2 holes from 4 days ago and it would have more nectar than a brand spanking new, gorgeous day one flower. So it actually makes some sense that the bees, in hitting a flower again and again and robbing it, might actually be getting quite a lot of nectar, okay? Now, what happens, what's the plant perspective when that happens on having flowers robbed again and again? It may actually be in the benefit of plants, right? Because instead of spreading robbing across all your flowers, you have a few flowers that get robbed again and again and again. So it's like concentrating the damage. So bees, by choosing a behavior that's in their own interests, may actually be reinforcing the mutualism, which I think is really cool. And it's one more reason why it's not actually, we often think like cheating has to be punished, right? Well, maybe not. Maybe cheating, once again, is just not that costly because of the way the damage accumulates on these plants, okay? So again, here we have a case where, depending on if you're looking, which individuals you're looking at of an individual species, either you'd have to put that interaction between the two species in the mutualism slot or in the antagonism slot. At the very least, it's not beneficial to the plant. Once again, ton of stuff we don't know, right? Under what conditions, ecological conditions, will these interaction outcomes be kind of sticky, where cheaters continue cheating, cooperators continue cooperating, and traits kind of don't matter? And then what are the evolutionary consequences of these shifts for the persistence of mutualisms, for trait evolution? How do interactions that can be in two places at once evolve differently? Do they have different stability properties than interactions that sit in just one spot at the same time? So lots of questions there when you have context-dependent outcomes. And in particular, the dynamical consequences of that are just something that no one yet is really touching. Okay, fourth point, different kinds of interactions interact. By which I mean, particularly once you get beyond thinking about two species, what you find is that at the community scale, there's many interactions going on at once. We all know that. So many of us are community ecologists, right? There's pollination going on, there's herbivory going on, there's below ground, mycorrhizae going on. And all those interactions, multiple mutualisms are interacting with each other. And then different mutualisms and antagonisms are interacting with each other. Sometimes there's a shared species in there. And this is sort of the link between pairwise approaches to interactions, which is codified in this grid, and community ecology, right? It's the point at which you start to go above the two species level. Well, we barely are starting to study this, really mechanistically what's going on with how different interactions interact. And there's a lot of kinds of phenomena that fit into this. So the first is that some interaction outcomes depend on the presence of another interaction, okay? Now, this includes some very large classes of mutualism, in particular, protection mutualisms. So here's, ants defending aphids against predators. Here's oxpeckers that are taking ticks off the back of a large mammal. Here's, a classic obligate ant-plant mutualism where the ants are deterring herbivores. In all of these cases, you have a mutualism between a defender species and a defended species. But the only way that that's a mutualism is in the presence of a shared enemy. If that enemy is there, that is not necessarily going to be a mutualism, right? So it's only a mutualism in the presence of another species entirely, okay? So what is it if the enemy isn't there? Well, it can be a commensalism because your defender species is still feeding on the defended species. So for instance, the ant is still getting some food from the aphids. It's just not protecting the aphids from anything. So for instance, that. So it's still an interaction, but it's a +0 interaction, not a mutualism. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is that it flips in the absence of that third species. It actually flips from being a mutualism to an antagonism. This is another form of context dependency. It's when that third species is absent. So for instance, this situation with oxpeckers taking off ticks and protecting the large mammals from tick-borne disease. Well, agriculturalists in Africa call these vampire birds because what they're really known for is drinking the blood of animals. Yeah, they eat the ticks, but then they proceed to enlarge the wound and they feed on blood, which is what they really want. That's why they're eating the ticks, is to get the blood. So in the absence of a high problem posed by ectoparasites, these birds are antagonists to the mammals. They actually spread disease and cause blood loss, okay? So you change the community context, and now what was a mutualism is no longer a mutualism. And depending on the situation, either it becomes a commensalism or it becomes an antagonism. So that's one way that you can scale from thinking about these interactions as two species to expanding your perspective and thinking about even one more species, and things change. Another way that interactions interact is where there's a shared partner. For instance, when you have two mutualisms going on the same plant. For instance, plant pollinator interactions and plant seed disperser interactions, and then they interact. I had a great student, Kelsey Ewell, who looked at this in southwestern mistletoe. And it's a cool situation in which bees pollinate mistletoe flowers. Phainopepla birds are the only seed dispersers of mistletoe. Both of these are mutualisms. And the problem is Phainopepla spend an awful lot of their time eating pollinators because the plants are fruiting during the nesting season, and the birds have to bring insect food back to their nestlings. And what insects do they encounter? They encounter the pollinators. So you have two mutualisms butting up against each other and creating a serious problem for the plant. And Kelsey did a lot of both experimental and theoretical work to figure out the dynamics of that link. We've done other things, some work I've done with Mark McPeak and Sarah McPeak, looking at trait evolution when you have these three species networks, where you, in this case, where you have the presence of pollinators and herbivores, and how trait evolution works when the same traits influence both kinds of interactions. So these are cases where there's a shared partner and different interactions are interacting. And once again, that's taking us away from any one single spot on the interaction grid. And then the third, and this is where I want to show you some data, is cases where you have a guild of species that are all interacting with a shared partner. So each of these is a mutualism, but these guys are all interacting with each other. In particular, they are each other's competitor. So now we have an interaction where we have a multi-species interaction that's competitive, and that is playing out in a shared mutualism. So now we have an interaction between those kinds of interactions. And I've worked a lot on the theory underlying this with my past postdoc, Chris Johnson. But I want to tell you about the more empirical work on this. And this involves another system in the Southwest. This is barrel cactus, and it's all over my wonderful habitat in the Southwest. And this was done with a team of people, particularly based at Duke, over the years. And this is a case where pollination mutualisms are interacting with ant defense mutualisms, but the ant community, there's many ants that defend the plants, and the ants are interacting with each other in a competitive hierarchy. That's basically going on. So the deal is this. Most cacti have extrafloral nectaries, including saguaros, including prickly pears. Barrel cactus is unusual among cacti because the extrafloral nectar, which is coming out of these little yellow bumps at the top, secretes year-round. A lot of cacti, including prickly pears and chollas and saguaro, the nectar is only out when the plants are in flower. Barrel cactus is secreting it year-round for whatever reason. Ants come along, they feed on the nectaries, and they chase away or kill herbivores. So plants that attract ants are less attacked by herbivores. And you might think that a barrel cactus doesn't have herbivores. It has plenty. A lot of them are attacking the flowers and they're attacking the fruits. And so once there are ants on the plants, ants just being intrinsically mean, they are attacking herbivores. So the question is, what happens when there's pollinators? Because if the ants are defending the plants, are they messing with pollinators? So here, once again, you have two kinds of mutualisms. You have an ant defense mutualism. You have a pollination mutualism. And what happens when those two kinds of mutualisms interact? And then, as I'm going to show you, what happens when the ants start falling out competitively with each other? So that's kind of where we're going here. So here are the four main ant players that we looked at in southern Arizona. All of these are native ant species. We don't actually have much of a problem with invasive ants in the Sonoran Desert. It's just too dry for them. So they are very, very different in terms of how they behave, both to the plant and to each other, okay? They differ in the quality of defense that they give. So if we give the plant a standard number of herbivores, and there's a given one of these ants that are tending it, because the ants tend to kick off all the other ants of different species and monopolize a plant for themselves. So we can compare how good are they at kicking off herbivores. And they're different. And they also affect pollinators very, very differently. So if you want to look at how those two mutualisms interact, it matters which ant species you're talking about. And you know, we can contrast two of them that are really different. This is a Solenopsis, this is a native fire ant, and Chromatogaster. So what's the difference between them? Solenopsis eilani is ferocious. It's a very, very effective defender. You put herbivores on and it finds the herbivores and it shreds it and tosses it off the plant. Very good at that. The problem is it really likes to go in flowers. So what it also does is snip anthers and walk down with them. And it also scares bees. The bees come, they look, they see a Solenopsis in the flower, and they leave, okay? Beyond that, they actually attack the bees. This is a pinned bee that has an ant head clamped on its leg. So the bees actually know what they're doing to avoid these. So you'd have to say that this ant is a high benefit, high cost ant, right? High benefit in that it's a great defender, high cost, it messes with your pollination. You compare that to Chromatogaster. Chromatogaster is slightly on the lazy side. It's a so-so defender. It comes up, pokes around herbivores. More often than not, it attacks them. It takes a fairly long time to clear all the herbivores off. The advantage of Chromatogaster is it will not go in flowers. It's something about the odor of the flowers. It just won't go there. So you don't have a problem with Chromatogaster interfering with pollination, but it's also not that great if you're under attack, right? So who's your best mutualist? And this is a great question we ask about mutualism. It's like, you know, mutualist quality. Who are the best mutualists? Well, it completely depends on your environment, right? It depends on how much herbivory you have to cope with and whether there's a lot of bees around. If you're in a world where herbivory pressure is really high and there's enough bees around that, you know, you don't have a problem getting pollinated, this is the ant you want. It's going to get rid of those herbivores. But if you're in a situation where there's really not very many herbivores and maybe also pollinators are limiting, Chromatogaster is far and away the preferable ant defender you want. Now, what can the plant do about it? We're going to get to that. So it turns out that how this plays out is also dependent on interactions within this guild. because there's a competitive hierarchy here. Which ant kicks off which ant? And it works like this. Solenopsis xylani, the super aggressive ant to pollinators, the super aggressive ant to herbivores, is also super aggressive to the other ants. So if it comes onto a plant and one of these ants is on there, it kicks it off. And there's a very clear competitive hierarchy. That's Chromatogaster. And then these are two others. This is another native fire ant. This is Forelius, a very common desert ant. It gets kicked off by everybody, and it kind of runs from danger. So it also doesn't attack herbivores. And it's kind of at the bottom of the heap. Okay. So who are the best mutualists? Well, it all depends, as I say, on what the environment is. So if herbivory is high and pollinator limitation is low, that's the ant you want, because it's going to kick off your herbivore. Otherwise, it's not the ant you want, right? Chromatogaster, it's the best ant if herbivory is low and pollen limitation is high. Otherwise, you don't want it, okay? So competitive dominance, high. What's the implication? Well, extrafloral nectar that comes out of cacti is just like food on a platter, okay? This is not a mutualism where the plant can regulate the reward very much. It oozes out of the nectary. That yellow blob is the nectary, and the ant that comes is the ant that comes. And so the implication is you can't necessarily get the defender you want. You get the defender you get. Okay, even though we could say, if we knew enough about the environment, which is the best ant. And that's all a function of something we couldn't have predicted unless we expanded our scope to realize the competition is driving all of this. And I made the joke to a few of you this week that the reason I went into mutualism to study mutualism is that everybody was studying competition and I didn't want to do it, right? I was like a conflict avoider. And God help me, I ended up studying competition because it underlies all of this stuff. Now, this implication, you can't always get the defender you want. This is especially true in a warming world. It's like, whoa, I've managed to go through 2 lectures here, and I have not mentioned the fact that the world is warming up. It's a little embarrassing. So now, what on earth does climate change have to do with any of this? Why should the story I just told you be influenced by the fact that the world is warming? Well, it's easy. It's because there's also a gradient among these ant species in thermal tolerance. And this is a well-known thing, I must have some ant biologists here, that there is a trade-off between thermal tolerance and competitive dominance. Ants that are very, very high in the competitive hierarchy also have very narrow thermal limits. And as soon as it gets hot, they're out of there. Meanwhile, you have this ant that runs from danger. It's out there in the middle of the day in the summer running across the desert soil where it's 140 degrees or something. It's highly thermal tolerant. So you think about that and you play the world forward. What's going to happen as the Sonoran Desert warms up? This is the ant we're going to be stuck with, right? And we know their temperature limitations of these different ants. And it's pretty clear that we're heading to a world where the only ant mutualist that's left is the worst possible one because it's the thermally tolerant one. So the competitive inferior species in a hotter world is going to win. Okay, so I've been through a lot of systems, and I hope I haven't completely overwhelmed you in my goal to talk about these 4 points. So let me just kind of review where we were. Interactions can map to more than one place on the grid. So species can interact with each other simultaneously in very different ways. And the big question that I've been interested in is whether the components of these interactions, for instance, the adult stage and the larval stage, did they evolve at separate times, or do they evolve together? Some really interesting questions about complex life histories and how they play out for interactions. The second point, that interaction outcomes shift over evolutionary time between, for instance, mutualism breaking down to parasitism, or parasitism, being overlaid by mutualism in the case of the Datura system. We know it happens, but we know very little about when or why or how it happens. We have a lot of great models. We don't have tests of the models. The third point, interaction outcomes vary in ecological space and time. So many fabulous stories about context-dependent mutualisms. And I've talked to a lot of you about your own work where you shift ecological context a little bit, and for instance, you need the mycorrhizae more or less, or they become costly, or so on. We know this is ubiquitous in mutualism. You would think that mutualism theory would incorporate context dependency so that we could ask questions like, are more context-dependent mutualisms, do they evolve differently than less context-dependent? Open field. People have not gotten there as far as thinking. We don't know if it affects how mutualisms evolve. We don't know if it affects how stable mutualisms are, what their place is in food webs and interaction networks, and so on. It's out there. It's just not in our conceptual theoretical framework about mutualism yet. And then interactions interact. So we're barely starting to study the distribution and significance of these effects. I've given you a bunch of stories about them, but we don't yet know the landscape in which these interactions interact. And of course, there's more. What's going on with those guys, right? So the interaction grid obviously doesn't capture any of that stuff, right? It only starts to bring it in once you start getting those boxes dissolved in the figure or in your mind. So, I said this is where I've gotten to so far. So kind of the question is, what do I do now? Where is my thinking going? What do I want to do next? Because, Fernanda, you're wonderful. I love the whole story about my legacy, but it's not over, obviously. And, I'm still at it. And I don't want to keep doing the same thing, right? I want to do new questions. So what are some of the things I want to do? Well, we know so much about mutualism now, which we did not when I was in graduate school. But now it's time for it to kind of rejoin the family, right? To stop just studying mutualism, which is what I've been advocating for so long, and to have it rejoin the family. So how can we do that? Well, we need to get rid of the grid, for one thing. And it's interesting to think, if you're a visual person, it's like, can we think of like getting rid of those boxes and replacing it with some kind of conceptual framework that doesn't look like a box? And this is a very interesting one, and it's a interaction continuum, where now you see interactions kind of blending into each other. So mutualism is a plus, and then one plus gets smaller and smaller and smaller until you're at commensalism. Or that plus, that zero stays and the plus gets smaller and smaller and smaller until you're at neutralism. And this could help us visualize how and when and why interactions will shift and vary. So it kind of captures interaction dynamism. I'd love to say this is my figure. The guy who invented the interaction grid in the 1950s immediately abandoned it and came up with this. But it was the interaction grid that made it into Odom's ecology textbooks in the 1950s, and this one got forgotten. So look it up. So what could you do with the grid? Well, now you could start to map interactions in this kind of space. So for instance, here is my Datura Manduka story. So it's mutualism at one life history phase, it's plus minus at another, and it jumps back and forth depending on where you are in the life history. Here's another one. Here's an interaction, for instance, and this goes far beyond mutualism, that is a predator-prey interaction, and then it shifts in space or in time or evolutionary time such that the plus becomes smaller and smaller, and it ends up as an amensalism. Here's one in which, under different ecological situations, it falls somewhere in that bar. So now we can start to map interactions, instead of in one place, we can start to put them in multiple places, maybe mathematize this, maybe start imagining, vectors that move and speeds at which that goes. There's a lot you could potentially do with this. Has it been done? No, but somebody should do it. So that's one thing, is let's get rid of the grid and think about a better visualization. The second thing that I just want to mention is everything I've been talking about today is between species interactions, right? It's competition, it's predation, it's mutualism. Well, of course, there's also within species cooperation. And I've gotten super interested in this divide, this very old historical divide between cooperation within species and cooperation between species. Very different histories of those fields, different people carry them out, but they're not independent. And it's really interesting. I mean, just think about, 3 different situations. Bees communicate among each other. They share information, and that affects where they forage. That's within species cooperation. And it plays out in the between species component, bees as pollinators, right? Here we have aphids, which are interacting socially in some very interesting ways, including aphids that have soldier castes that defend themselves. And then aphids are interacting in mutualisms with ants that defend them. And humans, we're cooperators. And in some cases, for instance, the amazing mutualism between humans and honey guide birds, we interact mutualistically with other species. So these 2 levels within species cooperation and between species cooperation have many things in common, and they share species in common, and yet we talk about them as if they are fundamentally different things. And they aren't. They interact in really cool ways. And just to plant some of these ideas in your mind, and I can give you examples if you're interested. Within species cooperation can change the dynamics of how mutualism works, for instance, through information sharing. Mutualisms, in some cases, can alter the dynamics of within species cooperation, or both 1 and 2 can happen simultaneously. And the benefits of cooperation in some cases can accrue either from cooperating with members of your same species or different species. So for instance, in flocks of birds that include both members of the same and different species. Both things are happening simultaneously. So I think this is a really rich opportunity to not only get rid of the interaction grid, but go beyond even all those interactions that are shown and start making a link to behavior and what's going on at the individual level. So that's where I am. After having spent, my whole career on mutualism, I am busting out of the box, and that's the next thing to do. And do I have any idea how to do it? I have no idea how to do it, but I know what questions I want to ask. And I want to thank everybody very much, from my mentors to the people who've really taught me what's what, which is my present and past graduate students. And I want to thank all of you guys and my 4 visits now to give seminars at Davis. Every single one of them has been memorable and has shaped the way I think about species interactions. And thank you all very much. And I'm happy to take questions, assuming we have time. Jay?
Sorry.
Yeah.
To integrate something else, whether it's stress gradient or something else, into that interaction circle to get more than, your interaction bounces all over that grid, but why? Right. Why does it bounce all over that grid? Is that predictable, or is every interaction just kind of unique?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the way I would probably approach it is to say take some kind of interaction, like these protection mutualisms are particularly context dependent because they're so dependent on the presence of a third species. And let's map a lot of them on, hypothetically. And then we could start to say, oh, there's 2 classes of these. There's the ones that vary along this axis, And then there's the ones that vary on that axis. What ecologically might be different about those two? So let the data, as we map them, suggest to us that there's some hidden predictability in how things move. So for instance, one thing, possibility you could think of is, for instance, by mapping enough interactions, you'd find out, does mutualism tend to, plus tend to evolve to plus minus more than plus minus evolve to plus plus? And then what about commensalism? And this paper actually is about commensalism. Because the question is, that we were getting at was, in the transition from mutualism to predation, do interactions get stuck in commensalism? Or is commensalism plus zero, just like this thing you pass through very, very briefly? So you could look to see which interactions, as you map these out, get stuck at a particular place, and then say, what do those interactions have in common? That's probably how I would go about it. Some people think this is already too many dimensions, to use. And then other people say this shouldn't be a circle, it should be XY space. And if you think that, then I probably can be made to agree with you. So people don't like it as a circle, because they think that bound means something. But the thing is, that's a question, how are you going to incorporate all the schmear of space? You don't have those questions until you try alternative ways of illustrating the data, which is what this gets you over the grid. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I was curious, with the example of the bees showing consistent differences in the nature of their species interaction, I was curious, does that trait appear to be, or is speculated to be, heritable in any way? Or is it just...
It's a great question. So why do bees keep doing one thing? So what's different about individuals in a bee species that are very consistently doing two radically different behaviors? There's a few possibilities, and we don't know. We've taken genetic material, clipping a leg, from a lot of bees that consist of one of these bee species that consistently are pollinating and are consistently robbing. And it's waiting to be analyzed to see if they're from different colonies. If they're from different colonies, it still doesn't necessarily tell you it's genetically based. It could be a difference in what has been communicated to them. So there's a few possibilities. One is they learn something early in their life, or they learn something early in the day, which keeps them doing a single thing. Or the other thing is they're genetically different. Is some simple things. The simplest thing I thought of at the time was that smaller individuals will be robbers because the tongue is too short to get down into the corydalus flower. And then the longer tongued bees are going in the right way. It's definitely not that. There's no size predictability. But it's an open question. And I think for this set of questions, what we really need for that collaboration is someone who is more of a insect cognitive ecologist. Becky and I very much are coming at it from the perspective, we think about bees, Becky thinks about bees all the time, but our focus initially was on plants, in part because we assumed that being robbed was really bad. That was our starting point. Makes sense. In the course of this, we discovered that, and I've told a number of people this, is that with corydalus, that long pink flower, we can pick up absolutely no cost of being robbed. The reason is that when bees are convinced that they're pollinators, they're not checking out to see if there's a hole and skipping over those flowers. So the flowers that have holes get just as much visits from pollinators as the flowers that got robbed. So robbing has no cost. So in that plant, we don't need to worry about the cost of being robbed, which is interesting. With robbing, you can find plant species where robbing is terrible. You can find plant species where it makes no difference at all, like mine. You can find a few cases where robbing actually benefits a plant. So that's a great case of what predicts that, right? It's like, again, now that we know that, we can start to look at, is that a bee thing? Is that a plant thing? What predicts it?
All right, we'll take one more question.
So to your point that interactions interact, with this idea that climate change might favor the least competitive and least defensive of those ant defenders, what do we know about how climate change is affecting the organisms that the ants are defending against?
It turns out that the herbivores have very, very high thermal tolerances. So in a hotter world, we're going to have more hemipteran herbivores and the worst ant. And that's sort of been where it's at with our early assumption. And I just want to emphasize, you start with all these assumptions that turn out to be wrong. We assumed that like the cacti would be fine in a hotter Sonoran desert. And so what we really needed to worry about was how these ant-herbivore interactions played out. New work says that barrel cactus is not going to do well at all in a warmer world. So it's possible that the fact that the mutualisms will change is the least of their problems. And what's really going to doom them is the hotter temperature, pure and simple, that they are not going to be able to grow in. Sadly.
I'm doing it. We want to thank Judith for being here, and yes, so